I didn't bother answering when the HOA president shouted across the folding table that I was trespassing on their private event. She was red in the face, one hand gripping a clipboard like it was a weapon, the other waving toward the makeshift roadblock they'd set up across the subdivision's only access road. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't even look at her. I just slid a manila folder across the table, right toward the HOS attorney. Inside was a single photocopy, the original county right-of-way deed from 1972. My name was stamped on the easement in black ink, and it gave me, not them, permanent, uncontested access. The lawyer went pale before he even finished the first paragraph, and that silence spread across the room like a cold front rolling in. For the first time in months, I felt the power shift, and I didn't have to raise my voice to do it. That moment didn't come out of nowhere. It took me a long time, too long, to reach it. And to understand why it meant so much, you'd have to rewind a little back to when things were simple. Back to when I actually believed I'd found the quiet I was looking for. I hadn't come out here to pick a fight with anyone. Truth is, all I wanted was peace. After 30 years of running my own business in the city, I'd grown tired of the constant noise, the traffic, the neighbors stacked wall to wall, the endless grind of schedules that didn't care whether you needed a moment to breathe. My wife and I had always talked about moving somewhere quieter once the kids were grown, and when my youngest finally went off to college, I figured it was time. The land I found wasn't much on paper, but it felt like a gift. It was on the edge of an older subdivision, not the flashy kind with big gates and manicured lawns, but a place built back in the 70s when people still believed in space and privacy. There was one narrow road winding through it all, a cracked asphalt strip that curved past ranch-style homes and into a clearing where my little parcel sat. My house was modest, a one-story with peeling paint and a porch that creaked under its own age, but the property stretched wider than most, giving me a bit of elbow room. On the far side, a stand of cottonwoods leaned against a shallow creek. I remember standing there the first evening, listening to the frogs, watching the last of the daylight spill across the water, and thinking, this is it. This is the place I'll grow old. Life slipped into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings walking the property line just to feel the space under my boots. I fixed small things around the house at my own pace, a leaky faucet here, a loose railing there. I planted tomatoes in a little raised bed by the garage and found a rhythm in tending them. On weekends, I'd drive into town, buy supplies, maybe stop by the feed store just to chat with the old-timers who never seemed in a hurry. My wife and I had plans for the place, nothing grand, just comfort. A shed for tools, maybe a dock by the creek if I could figure out the permits. For once in my life, I wasn't thinking about deadlines. I wasn't chasing anything. I was letting myself be, and if you'd asked me then what I thought about the HOA, I would have shrugged. I knew there was one technically, but it barely registered. They didn't bother me, and I had no reason to bother them. I assumed it was one of those sleepy boards that met once a quarter, maybe sent out a newsletter about lawn care. I didn't sign up for committees, didn't attend meetings. I paid my modest dues and figured that was the end of it. Honestly, I thought it might even be a good thing, some small layer of order to keep the road patched and the common areas clean. I never imagined they'd take that thin bit of authority and twist it into something ugly. For a while, it was exactly the life I'd hoped for. I didn't feel the weight of neighbors watching, didn't hear cars tearing down the street at all hours, didn't deal with the usual petty nonsense of city living. Just peace. And maybe that's why it hit so hard when the first crack appeared, because I had finally let myself believe I was safe from that kind of nonsense. The first sign of trouble didn't even look like trouble at first. It looked like a piece of paper flapping under the wiper blade of my truck one Saturday morning. I'd driven into town the night before to pick up some lumber and parked the truck along the gravel shoulder in front of my own place. Nothing unusual. But when I stepped outside with my coffee, there it was, a bright orange slip that at first glance I thought was some kind of utility notice. When I pulled it off, I realized it wasn't from the county, and it sure wasn't from the city. It was stamped with the HOS letterhead, and in block letters it read, "Violation unauthorized vehicle parking." At first, I laughed. Honestly, I thought it was a mistake. The unauthorized vehicle was my truck, parked in front of my own property, on a strip of gravel I'd personally shoveled and maintained since moving in. Surely this was meant for someone else. But as I kept reading, the laughter dried up. The note went on to explain that my vehicle was blocking common access and that I was in violation of community traffic flow rules. Then, at the bottom, it warned that repeat violations could result in fines, towing, or legal action. I remember standing there on that cool morning, coffee in one hand, paper in the other, just blinking at it. Blocking access? The road was empty. No traffic. No cars had even passed since I'd stepped outside. And besides, there was no common access in front of my place, just the gravel shoulder, a ditch, and my yard. My truck wasn't blocking anything except maybe a dandelion. I showed it to my wife, who read it twice and shook her head. "Must be a mix-up," she said. "Just call them." So I did. I tracked down the number on the notice and left a polite voicemail explaining that the vehicle was mine, that it wasn't blocking anyone, and asking if perhaps they'd taped the wrong truck. A day later, I got a call back. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just a curt voice telling me that all vehicles must comply with HOA regulations. When I asked which regulation specifically prohibited parking in front of my own property, the line went silent for a beat. Then the woman repeated the same sentence, word for word, as if reading from a script. And before I could push further, she hung up. That was the first time I felt it, that quiet sting of something's not right here. But I still didn't think it was serious. I figured it was just a board member on a power trip, someone who had nothing better to do than shuffle papers and make up rules. I didn't lose sleep over it. I moved the truck into the driveway, tossed the notice in a drawer, and told myself it would blow over, except it didn't blow over. A week later, I got another notice. This one claimed I was in violation for obstructing common property because I had left lumber stacked along my garage. Never mind that the lumber was neatly piled on my own land, clearly within my boundary line, not blocking a soul. A week after that, another slip appeared, this time accusing me of unauthorized alteration of landscaping because I had trimmed the overgrown hedges near my porch. It was absurd. It was petty. But each one carried the same line at the bottom in bold. Failure to comply may result in fines or legal action. By the third notice, my patience had shifted from amusement to unease. Not anger, not yet, but unease. Because I knew enough about how these things worked to realize that every slip of paper was building a record. And records could turn into fines, and fines could turn into liens and liens. Well, I'd seen more than one family lose property because a bored little board decided they wanted to make someone's life miserable. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with that third notice in hand, listening to the wind push against the windows, and thinking, this isn't going away on its own. If they can invent violations out of thin air, what's next? Things civilly only to be met with silence, mockery, and growing pressure, which slowly shifts your mindset from patience to cold strategy. At first, I thought maybe it could still be smoothed over with a little common sense. I wasn't looking to make enemies. So I wrote a letter. Nothing dramatic, just a polite explanation. I pointed out that my truck was on my own property, that my lumber wasn't obstructing anything, and that trimming a hedge wasn't exactly a federal offense. I even included copies of my property survey, highlighting the boundary lines in case there was some confusion. I dropped it in the SO mailbox slot near the clubhouse and figured that was that. 2 weeks went by. No reply, no acknowledgement. The only thing I got was another notice, this one accusing me of disregard for HOA directives, because I hadn't remedied prior violations. It didn't even bother listing what violations they meant. Just a blanket statement like they were building a case without needing details. So I tried again, this time sending an email. I kept it courteous even when I didn't feel like it. I asked for clarification, asked which bylaw I was supposedly breaking. I asked for a meeting to sit down and talk like adults. The response I got wasn't from the board. It was from their hired management company. A two-line email that read, "Violations are recorded and fines may be applied. Please see your governing documents." That was it. No explanation, no attempt at dialogue. Just a brush dash off dot. By then, the neighbors were starting to notice. A few of them avoided eye contact when I waved. Others offered a thin smile, the kind you give when you don't want to be involved. Word travels fast in places like this, and I could feel the quiet shift. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it was distance. The kind that makes you realize you've been marked, I'll admit. I tried one more time to reason with them. I went to a board meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, folding chairs set up in rows, coffee in a carafe at the back. I sat near the middle, waited my turn, and when the agenda opened for homeowner comments, I stood and calmly explained my situation. I thought maybe if they saw me face to face, heard my voice, they'd realize I wasn't the enemy. Instead, the president leaned back in her chair, smirked, and said, "Sir, if you don't like living in a community with standards, maybe you bought in the wrong place." A couple of board members chuckled. One whispered something, and they all laughed. I remember my ears burning, not with embarrassment, but with clarity. That was the moment I realized it wasn't a misunderstanding. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were testing me, pushing to see how much I'd take. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just sat back down, hands folded, listening as they moved on to the next item like my life wasn't even worth the courtesy of discussion. But inside, something had shifted. The days of polite letters and hopeful phone calls were done. That night, I went home, poured myself a drink, and pulled out every piece of paper I'd ever signed when I bought this place. I spread the deed, the survey, the closing documents across the table like a puzzle. And for the first time since moving in, I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like an adversary, because if they were going to make this a game of rules and documents, then rules and documents were exactly where I was going to beat them. Once I made the decision to stop playing nice, my whole approach changed. I wasn't writing letters anymore. I wasn't asking for meetings that went nowhere. I started treating the HOA the way they had treated me, as a legal problem, not a neighborly disagreement. The first thing I did was drive down to the county recorder's office. It's an old brick building in town, tucked behind the courthouse, with fluorescent lights that hum overhead and clerks who've been there long enough to know where every piece of paper is buried. I asked for the subdivision records, all of them. Deeds, plats, easements, covenants, amendments, anything tied to the original development. The clerk gave me a raised eyebrow, then wheeled out a cart stacked with folders that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I sat there for hours, flipping through brittle pages, the smell of dust and ink filling the little research room. And that's when I found it, the line that changed everything. In the original 1972 development documents, long before the HOA was even incorporated, the county had granted a perpetual right-of-way across that road. Not to the HOA, not to the subdivision, to the original landowner whose parcel had later been divided, one of which I now owned. My property wasn't just another lot on the map. It was tied, by deed, to the only legal access road into the entire subdivision. That meant something simple but devastating. They couldn't block me from that road. They couldn't fine me for using it. They couldn't even technically control it because the right-of-way superseded their authority. That strip of cracked asphalt they were so proud of barricading for their little events, on paper it was mine to use. Always had been. Always would be. From that moment on, I started keeping meticulous records. Every notice they posted, I photographed. Every letter I scanned and backed up in 3 places. I began logging dates, times, who was present, what was said. I wasn't paranoid, I was preparing. If this went to court, I wanted a timeline that a judge could follow without missing a beat. At home, my wife worried. She'd see me hunched over the table at midnight, papers spread everywhere, a legal pad filling with notes. "You're letting them get to you," she said more than once. And maybe she was right. But I couldn't shake the thought that if I ignored them, if I let them keep building this case of violations, one day we'd wake up with a lien on the house or worse. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Neighbors started to notice my distance too. Where once I'd waved, I now kept my head down. A few folks whispered that the board was cracking down on me. Some avoided me altogether, not wanting to be dragged into the conflict. That isolation stung, but it also sharpened me. If they wanted me boxed in, they'd underestimated how well I operate when cornered. The nights grew longer, my stack of documents thicker. And each time I revisited that deed, that one clean, typed page from 1972 with the county seal stamped at the bottom, I felt a steadiness settle in. They could send 100 violation slips. They could sneer at me in meetings. None of it mattered because I was holding the trump card and they didn't even know it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't scared. I was patient, and patience in this kind of fight is lethal. The moment finally came on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. The HOA had decided to throw one of their big neighborhood parties, the kind with banners strung across the road, folding tables set up like checkpoints and orange cones blocking both entrances. They called it Community Day, but it felt more like a show of power. The whole subdivision was funneled into their little event, and anyone trying to drive through was forced to stop and check in. It might have been amusing if it hadn't been so illegal. When I eased my truck down the road that afternoon, I saw the president herself standing by the barricade, clipboard in hand, barking instructions like she was directing traffic at a stadium. When she spotted me, her face tightened. She stepped right in front of my truck and motioned for me to stop. "You can't come through here," she said, walking up to my window with a theatrical wave of her clipboard. "This road is closed for the community event. Residents need to park and walk." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just parked, got out, and walked straight toward the folding table where their attorney was sitting in the shade, sipping a bottle of water and looking bored. The president trailed after me, voice raised now so half the neighborhood could hear. "Sir, you are trespassing on common property. You are in direct violation of the board's directive." I didn't bother looking at her. I set a plain manila folder down on the table in front of their laoar. He frowned, opened it, and started reading. Inside was the original county right-of-way deed from 1972, highlighted, underlined, and certified. My parcel's easement rights spelled out in black ink. Perpetual, non-transferable, beyond the reach of any HOA bylaw. I'll never forget the way his face drained of color. He read it once, then again, slower. His lips parted, but no words came. And when the president leaned over his shoulder demanding to know what it said, he didn't answer her. He just rubbed his temple, closed the folder, and cleared his throat. That silence was better than any speech I could have given. I turned to the board, to the handful of neighbors watching from lawn chairs, and said calmly, "This road is not yours to close. It never has been. The county deed is clear, and I have full right-of-way. Any further attempt to block access will be met with legal action. No shouting. No theatrics. Just fact." The president sputtered something about community spirit and respecting rules, but her voice shook now. The lawyer didn't back her up. He slid the folder back across the table like it was radioactive dop, and in that moment, the power they thought they had evaporated. All the notices, the fines, the smirks in board meetings, gone. They couldn't touch me, not with that deed in my hand. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I just picked up the folder, tucked it under my arm, and walked back to my truck. The cones were dragged aside before I even reached the barricade. For the first time in months, I drove that road without a knot in my stomach. After that day, things changed. Not all at once, but steadily, like the thaw after a long winter. The notices stopped arriving. No more slips under my wiper, no more threats taped to the garage. The mailbox was suddenly quiet. And the next time the board scheduled a community event, there was no barricade across the road. They set up their tables on the grassy common lot instead, like they should have done from the beginning. Word spread faster than I expected. Within a week, neighbors who had been keeping their distance started making small talk again. A few admitted, in hushed tones, that they'd thought the board had overstepped for months but were too afraid to speak up. One older gentleman even told me he remembered the original landowner back in the 70s, and he'd always wondered if the board was bluffing about their control over the road. He chuckled when I told him about the deed, like it was an inside joke that had taken 50 years to land. The board itself didn't collapse overnight, but the cracks were obvious. The president's voice didn't carry the same weight anymore, and when she snapped orders, people hesitated. At the next annual meeting, attendance was higher than anyone could remember. Questions were sharper. Accountability was suddenly a word on everyone's lips. By the end of the year, the president quietly resigned for personal reasons. 2 other board members followed. The management company was replaced with a smaller local firm that seemed more interested in potholes than power trips. As for me, life settled back into the rhythm I'd wanted all along. The tomatoes grew in their raised bed. The creek kept on humming at night. I parked my truck wherever I needed to without glancing over my shoulder. And every time I drove down that cracked old road, I felt a small, steady satisfaction knowing I had done more than just defend myself. I had reminded them where their authority ended. These days, the neighbors wave again. Some smile. A few still turn away, and that's fine too. I don't need their approval. What I needed was peace, and I have it back. Sometimes I think about that night at the kitchen table. Papers spread across the wood, my wife worrying that I was letting the HOA get under my skin. Maybe I was. But I also know this. If I hadn't fought back, if I hadn't dug through those old records, they would have kept pushing. And people like that, people who mistake a clipboard for a crown, only stop when you show them the line they cannot cross. Now, when I hear the quiet hum of tires on the road at dusk, I smile. Because that right-of-way isn't just ink on paper. It's freedom. It's proof that calm persistence can outlast noise, and in this neighborhood, silence is finally on my side.